Now let's look at one of the real innovations within Essence, something that's very different from how we work normally, and which, to get the best of, really requires a little bit of a pivot in mindset. And it's how we measure progress. Now, Essence measures progress by state. We have the things that we want to measure the progress of. Essence calls those alphas, but they're the big things that you care about, like goals, like your sprint, like improvements, like your requirements, like your stakeholders, things like that. And each of these has a number of states that you want to work your way through. And what is important to measure progress is not how much work you've done to get through those states, it's which state you're in. It doesn't matter how much I did to get to a given state. What it matters is that is the state that I am in. And that's very different from how we often think about measuring progress or measuring the remaining work. Because very often what we measure instead of what state we're in is how much work we've done, or how much work we think is remaining, or how much time we've spent, or how much time we spent is remaining. And we've all done that. We've all seen projects where somebody asks, how far through the project are we? And the answer is, we're 80% of the way through. And we know that because of all the tasks that we thought we would need to do to complete the job, we've done 80% of them, and we've got 20% left. So we've got 1/5 left. We've probably all heard the phrase, the last 20% of the project takes 80% of the time. And that's because it's true. It's very often true. And that's because humans are very bad at measuring time. We're also very bad at responding to change. So when we get to that last 20% of tasks, A, they take longer, but more importantly, they're not the last 20% of tasks. Very often, there are many more tasks required in addition to that 20% before we can really say that we are complete. So even when we try very hard to analyze very well, we're always going to make these mistakes. And that's why measuring progress by time or by work doesn't work very well. And that's why Essence doesn't do that. Instead, we look at measuring state to show us what the progress we've made. So here's some examples. Here's 3 different things that we want to understand the progress of, alphas in Essence terms. We have our stakeholders, and we care about what state they're in. And some of the states are things like these. So recognized, involved, satisfied for deployment. These are important things that once we're in that state, it's good to know that we're there, right? From Kanban, we've got the service. We identify the service, then we visualize it, often using a Kanban board. We monitor it, then it's maturing, and finally it's in flow. And then the sprint goal. A bit simpler, it's identified, we have committed to it, and it's assessed. In each of these cases, each of those states is something that if somebody said to me, are you in that state? And I said, yes, you get quite a lot of information. It's meaningful. Also, to get to that state might take a lot of work, or it might take a little amount of work. But what's important is the result of the work, not the work itself. There's no value in doing work. There's value in what the work achieves. What the work achieves is maintaining a state or getting to a new state. So how do we know what state we're in, or how do we know that we have achieved a state? Well, that's where Essence helps us as well with checklists. Now, checklists are interesting because they can feel a little bit obvious. You know, the core Kanban metric, lead time, is collected and observed. Well, of course, if I'm going to have a metric, obviously I'm going to collect it and observe it. But is it obvious? And even if it is obvious, does it mean that it's happening? Now, we look at where else people use checklists. And 2 of the big places people use checklists are on aircraft and in hospitals. And you wouldn't think that you'd need checklists for the obvious things in a hospital, but you do. In a study in Michigan, 30% of operations were going wrong because of dead simple things, like not putting on the right PPE, or putting on the wrong patient, or not washing your hands properly. All the really basic stuff. When you introduce a physical checklist and you ask the surgeons to tick each of those things, they do make sure they've done them. And these are really bright people. And the really complicated stuff was probably getting done fine, but some of the obvious basic stuff was getting forgotten. And that's why checklists are really important, because they help us stay honest. They help us do the basic things as well as the more complex things. And they force us to check that we've actually done something before we can say that that progress has been achieved. So on the example on the left, the representatives are happy with their involvement. Let's tick that, shall we? But wait a second, let's not tick that just yet. Let's ask the reps, are you happy with your involvement? How happy are you? Are you happier than before or not so happy? Because just blindly ticking that or just coming back in a month and saying that's still ticked, I want to be checking that. So what the checklists do is they really help us understand that. And again, coming back to my previous point, just because something's a tick box, it might be simple to tick it, or it might take a lot of work. The important thing isn't the work, whether it's a lot or little, or who does it. The important thing is that that checklist is achieved, and therefore the state gets achieved. So that's an example of how this works. So I want to talk a little bit about why that's really important. And it comes back to the difference between how we do things in Essence and how things are more traditionally done. You've probably heard the term leading and lagging indicators. So a leading indicator helps us identify risk and potential problems and potential success, to be honest, before they become issues. So they give us advance warning of something. Now, the problem with measuring task completion and time spent is that they're not leading indicators. They're lagging. I don't measure them until after they've happened. So I already know that I've spent the time. I don't know that I'm going to spend the time. And that's a problem because it means that typically we don't find out about risk until it's far closer to being an issue. States and checklists are leading indicators. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So here's our service. And in the monitored state, one of the indicators is that the core metric lead time is collected and observed. Now, let's say that I haven't ticked that. My service might be running just fine. But if we're not collecting the metrics, we might not know when it stops being fine to keep the flow. And that might result in work staying in our system longer than it should, because that lead time is increasing. And that isn't what we want. Whereas if I do monitor and collect those metrics, then I'll spot little changes in the wrong direction before they become a big problem. And that lets me adjust to bring them back to where I want to, or perhaps adjust expectations. It might be my lead time is getting longer, and that's important to share with my stakeholders, rather than them noticing, hold on a second, everything that used to take a day is now taking 5. What's going on? Second example, then looking at that stakeholders card of being in agreement. It's the one I talked about. Are the reps still happy? Because this is another really important thing with measuring progress, is states are additive. So to be in the third state or the fourth state like this one, it depends upon the other state still being true. So if I want to get to state 5, for example, with stakeholders, I need to go back and check that state 4 is still true, and 3, and 2, and 1. And if any of those have stopped being true, then that might be a risk. So let's say I'm checking state 5 or 6, and I go back and check state 4, and I realize my reps are no longer happy with their involvement. Well, what might happen as a result? Maybe the quality of their input is not as good as it was. Maybe they stop attending all the meetings. Maybe they care less about the quality of the product. And what I thought I was getting from them was a very high quality input. I'm no longer getting that. So things will go wrong that they would have noticed before, but now don't. I might not notice those things as being an issue until somebody else comes along at the end, maybe to accept the system, and they say, no, that's not good enough. So we can see that identifying these things early can give us advance warning of issues and problems that we'll see in the future. And that's why using state and checklists as a measure of progress isn't just a better way to measure progress, because you're measuring actuals and outcomes rather than inputs like work and time, but they also give you really powerful leading indicators of change, of risk, of potentially of success as well. So big part of Essence is thinking differently about progress, and states and checklists is how we do it.